Thank you, Becca. We're all getting a little loopy here late in the day, so but we've got this really wonderful session. So hang in and focus in. There's a lot that we're going to cover, but we have a really wonderful panel here that's going to lead us through. And so the plan here for today is we're going to cover a little background of the climate action plan, kind of some of the process and context for how it came to be. We'll go over the draft of the climate action plan, kind of what's in it from a ag and ecosystem perspective, land use perspective. Then we're going to have some facilitated breakout discussions for about a half an hour, and we'll come back as a full group for report outs. That'll be another 15 minutes. And so just before I hand it over to Abby Course, I want to say that all of the people that we have here who will be presenting have put in a tremendous amount of effort into this process in a very short amount of time. And here's a great list of all the subcommittee members that are a part of this Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which we're reporting out on the recommendations that came out of that subcommittee. And I want to take some time, she might be embarrassed by this, but just really commend Abby Course, who's the co-chair of this group. She has done a tremendous job, a thankless job in many respects, for co-chairing the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And as you'll hear more, just the time frame of developing this plan has been very intense. We have been meeting every day on Friday, or every week on Friday for 2 hours each week. And Abby is doing way more than that each week because she has other responsibilities as a co-chair. So all the subcommittee members deserve our respect, admiration, thanks, but Abby in particular, I do want to make sure that we recognize that. So thank you, Abby. And so with that, let's start Abby with you to kind of kick us off and get us started with Vermont's climate action plan.
Hi, everybody. Jake, thank you. That's very kind, but the burden has been broadly shared and has not been mine alone, I'll say. Though the timeline has certainly presented a rash of challenges, we'll say. So hello, everybody. I'm Abby Course. I have served as the co-chair for the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee for the Vermont Climate Council. I also am an appointed member of the 23-member Vermont Climate Council, serving as the farm and forest sector representative. Just for a little bit of quick background, I farm organic dairy with my folks down in Whitingham, Vermont. We call it the Forgotten Kingdom. We're on the Massachusetts border. We're up at 2,000 feet. It's a very interesting set of equations, and we're grazing dairy and have been since 1868. And certainly that has really informed a lot of, I think, for my thinking about resilience and adaptation as we're contemplating the work ahead of us in this realm of thinking about how these sectors can adapt and remain resilient in the face of a changing climate, and holding on to those realities really closely. So Ryan will go into a little bit more detail about this, but the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee was fully seated, I believe, at the beginning of March, and that was when we began our work. So this has been a very, very quick timeline. And what we tried to do was assemble a group of people that I really felt like, in some ways, this was a new space. The bridging of the space between agriculture and ecosystem function, right? The environmental sort of side of things and the agricultural side of things are things that we should be bridging all the time. These different sides, if you will, should be talking to each other and working together more often. There's so much commonality, and it is so necessary, as I see it, for anything to work moving forward. And so this was a bit of I think, groundbreaking in a way, in terms of what this subcommittee was tasked to do to bring those two components really together. And so we tried to assemble a team around the table that could bring in voices of various impacted communities. We do have an Indigenous representative. We had the youth member from the Climate Council. Myself as a farmer, John Roberts as representative of farmers, really trying to bring in a range of perspectives. Part of the reason that I applied to be on the Climate Council was because I think policy is so often made in isolation of the people who have to carry it out. And so that was really a guiding principle for me. And I think this group, as we try to contemplate the work ahead, what does it mean for everybody who is involved in needing to achieve resilience and adaptation in the food system and the agricultural economy as we move forward in this moment. And so that was really, I think, tried to be front and center of what we were thinking about. How can we capacitate people? How can we resource them? How can we have personal viability for the people who have to work in the food system to be able to do everything that's going to be asked of them as we move forward? And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan. But I have to say that it has been really hard. It has also been a true and genuine privilege to get to know better these folks that we've assembled here and the rest of the subcommittee. And I really do believe in the work that we've put forward and the conversations that we've held in the space that we've tried to hold in our meetings, not avoiding tensions, really trying to work to get to the heart of some of the genuinely complex and really nuanced issues that we're going to need to work through as we move forward. And I really want to extend my immense gratitude to everybody that has been a part of that effort. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to give us a little bit of a more granular level details about how we've gone about doing this. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Abby. Definitely have to agree wholeheartedly with, it's been great to work with everyone on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, tackling some very important and complicated topics that's been put forth in the charge for the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And this is one part of the whole picture that is going into making up the Climate Action Plan. Can folks see the title slide of the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I will. Thank you. So just some text. I'm going to try to go quickly through a lot of things because kind of the important part is the discussion and trying to understand what's in the Ag and Ecosystem section of what's been proposed to be included in the Climate Action Plan. But just trying to frame some of the work and timeline that's been going on here. The Global Warming Solutions Act, the GWSA as it's known, was passed as Act 153 of 2020. It establishes greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements for both 2025, 2030, and 2050. The GWSA created the Vermont Climate Council with 23 members, for which there were 4 subcommittees established in the law, one of which was Agriculture and Ecosystems, and 2 additional subcommittees were made by the Climate Council to support the work of the Climate Council with a steering committee and a Science and Data subcommittee. The Global Warming Solutions Act laid out that a climate action plan needs to be published by December 1st of 2021. And so that is what has made this deadline for the Climate Council to make these recommendations. After that, the Secretary of Natural Resources is charged to adopt rules to implement the Climate Action Plan on or before December 1st of that following year, 2022. And then within the law, there's a clause for a cause of action where any person may bring legal action against the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state's failure to meet the emission reduction requirements established in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And what we're going to focus on in this panel discussion is the Climate Council, the subcommittee work, and the discussions and recommendations that have come out of the subcommittee for the Climate Action Plan. But I just wanted to frame everything that's in the Global Warming Solutions Act. The Climate Council had its first meeting on November 20th of 2020, so we're barely a year into the Climate Council being a thing. I went through I was curious in preparing for this discussion. I count over 163, or at least 163 publicly noticed meetings across the Climate Council, the steering committee, its subcommittee, the public outreach meetings that are happened or have been scheduled between the 20th of November and December 1st of this year. And this does not include the non-quorum meetings, as an example, that the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee held in 5 sub-task groups to really undertake the charge that the subcommittee set out for itself in making these recommendations to the Climate Council. And so that's, you know, as Jake said, he said 2 hours. Well, we went to 3 hours in the past, I think, 3 months on Fridays. So we've increased the time that we're meeting. And it's just an incredible commitment of time from counselors, the public that has been participating in a very robust way throughout this entire process, attending most or all of the meetings on Fridays. And, you know, just the work that's gone into reading, reviewing, and making these recommendations. It's, you know, just trying to give a sense of the scale of work that's going on across not just agriculture and ecosystems, right? Many of the other subcommittees as well. So the pace of work has been frenetic, I feel, all along. You know, lots of deadlines and changing deadlines and process. What I put on the right, you really shouldn't be able to read. It's just, this is the schedule that was published for comments and review and revisions to get to the climate action plan in the past 2 months, and it's a lot of work. And so taking that, you know, this is the first climate action plan. It's scheduled to be updated at least once every 4 years. And in my mind, it has an incredible amount of work that's gone into it, and there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. And so it's not going to be the final word in the climate action plan development revision process. Some other states that have developed climate action plans have taken 2 to 3 years to complete. And to Abby's point, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee was seated early March of 2021. And so it's been less than a year that we've been grappling with these very important, time-sensitive issues. So the climate action plan is defined as something in the law to set forth specific initiatives, programs, and strategies, including any regulatory legislative changes that are needed to meet the state emission reduction requirements. In addition to that, there is also the requirement to build resilience to prepare the state's communities, infrastructure, and economy to adapt to the current and anticipated effects of climate change. So it's quite a robust plan. It then lays out specific initiatives and strategies that are to be included in the climate action plan. First of which are those greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements and how to meet them. How to encourage smart growth and related strategies, how to achieve long-term sequestration and storage of carbon and promote BMPs to achieve climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience on natural and working lands. And that's been a big focus of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Another goal of how to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors, how to reduce energy burdens for rural and marginalized communities, how to limit the use of chemical substances or products that contribute to climate change, and to build and encourage climate adaptation and resilience of Vermont's communities and natural systems. So this is no small task that was laid out for the Climate Council and the subcommittees, and we'll get into the details and the process and some of the recommendations of what Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittees put forward to address those within scope of the plan. So just to frame, you know, what Vermont's current greenhouse gas emissions look like, this is just one part of the puzzle. Agriculture is quantified to have 16% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions as quantified by the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. You know, Vermont, you know, climate change is a global issue, and Vermont in the big picture doesn't you know, have the largest single contribution, but that doesn't take away from the charge that was put before the Climate Council to work on emissions reductions and all the associated charges for building adaptation and resilience within the natural working lands. So as I've already said, Ag and Eco, as we call it, the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee was established in the law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, to focus on carbon sequestration and storage, climate adaptation, and ecosystem and community resilience. And then also laid out how the subcommittee will seek to understand current initiatives in the ag and forest sector, the businesses depend on them, and develop actions and policies that restore wetlands, increased carbon storage on ag and forest land, and also in forest products, and how to support healthy agricultural soils and a local food system. As we've reviewed, we had great subcommittee, co-chairs, members, and a lot of staff support from different agencies. And then just as a framing before we dive into talking about the actual work of the subcommittee is just, when we say natural and working lands, what do we mean? In my mind, it means, land use for agriculture, forestry, wetlands, grasslands, and they even throw water in there. But excluding water is about 94% of Vermont's land base. And so there's a lot of potential there for storage, sequestration, and providing a lot of adaptation and resilience, buffers and goals that are laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it on to the next part of our discussion. Thanks.
All right, we have a slide transition. So we'll now move over to actually what's in the plan and recommendations that are being proposed that are coming out of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And so Alyssa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so I'm going to get to share with Lauren. We'll split this part of the session today, just telling you kind of what's in the plan and the things that we've tried to elevate as a subcommittee. So if you would just click to the next slide. I think I'll start by just outlining kind of the key themes before we get deep into the details. So from the perspective of the subcommittee, we want to try to keep farms as farms, optimizing the existing carbon storage and enhancing the sequestration potential of agricultural lands. There's certainly a lot of land use pressures and changes that could be considered in this, and that seems really important. That was important to our subcommittee. The second piece I want to elevate is just that we want to highlight the way that farms can contribute to the solutions to climate change within of climate change, but also as well as being part of enhancing adaptation and resilience, both on farms and also to downstream communities and to neighbors. And there's a big ask to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from every sector. And so we're really trying to think innovatively about how we can do that within the farming sector, rather than trying to just eliminate cows or farmland, but to really think creatively about how we can change what we're doing to also meet those goals. And that's challenging, but that was certainly the approach that we took. And of course, supporting and growing local food systems and markets as being kind of critical to community resilience and resilience of the food system was another major theme of our work. And then also just realizing that we don't have to reinvent the wheel as this new subcommittee, but there is a ton of work that's already going on, and a lot of leadership and a lot of work that's already been done with the climate lens, or really that applies to climate work. And so we just kind of look to a lot of folks that are probably in this session have done work that we really look to highlight and hope that we can enhance investment in some of the great programs that already exist, and just add maybe a shared climate lens to the work that we're all doing together already. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We'll get into the details of kind of outlining what's in the plan. And I won't spend too much time on the details, but I think it's important for all of you that haven't had a chance to look at this to know kind of generally what's in there, so that we can have a nice informed discussion later. So, some of the recommendations that we made are really around a larger strategy, pathway of supporting and empowering land managers, farmers, foresters, other land workers to sustain and increase carbon sequestration. And so some of the specific strategies that we have recommended is increasing the adoption of practices that we know enhance soil carbon content. So those are lots of best management practices that you already know, but maybe also exploring others. And so behind that is really just expanding and fully funding existing programs that are already doing that work well. And maybe just with more funding could do even more of that. and kind of expand their reach and meet new folks that have been left out of those programs in the past. Another piece of this is supporting the development of a payment for ecosystem services type program to help meet these goals. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Lauren. So we just talked about, enhancing carbon sequestration. Another major goal is to empower and support land managers in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a number of different ways to do that, but manure management is a really big piece of this, as well as like thinking about how we can potentially look at methane capture or roofs or covers over manure storage in ways that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a big portion of agricultural emissions come from manure management. And so we have to think kind of creatively about how we address that. And enteric emissions is also another big piece of the emissions from the ag sector. And so, there's a bit to it. It's not as simple as just feeding every cow charcoal or seaweed, but we really think that promoting a new program or enhancing other programs that are looking really carefully about the intersection of, community health, environmental health around feed management, and to really look at that kind of from a research and practitioner perspective and develop some new strategies rather than just kind of these quick solutions. So I think that'll be really important new work for our community to continue to build in is how we find good data about how certain forages or feeds influence enteric emissions and what we can do. All right, enough about that. So, this also includes thinking about grazing and agronomic practices and how they influence greenhouse gas emissions, including from the soil surface and how fertilizer use influences nitrous oxide emissions. So maybe that was too long, but I think the next piece to say is that will also be important to think about responsible energy transformation on farms. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Lauren. Is this where I turn it over to you? I have one more. Maybe I'll do this one and then it's your turn. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to just talk a little bit about what's in the plan in terms of supporting farmers in enhancing climate resilience and adaptation on farms. So we know that farms are already on the front lines of dealing with climate impacts. If you were farming during Tropical Storm Irene, there's no way that you didn't feel the impacts of extreme weather. And that's the kind of stuff that we're projected to get more of. So we know that there's been work here already and that there's more to do. So really building more climate adaptation planning and training and technical assistance to support farmers in proactively adaptation practices and plans on farm is really important. We know that farmer to farmer learning already has supported farmers in implementing adaptation practices. So we want to encourage and just put resources towards more of that, as well as understanding how soil health and the soil sponge can be part of resilience and adaptation planning on farm. And then thinking about kind of whole farm water resource management, because we know that we're going to get more of those extremes in terms of precipitation trends. So, too much water all at once and then some dry spells. So thinking about how we can slow and prevent damage from heavy water events and catch it and keep it there in times when we need it. And then finally, enhancing resources for farm viability planning. So I think one option is to fully fund HCB and the farm viability program. We know it's doing great work and really critical to farms making it through big setbacks from climate impacts. Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Lauren to share some more of the details of what's in the plan.
Thanks, Alyssa. I guess I'll round out then the climate adaptation and resilience piece here in order to share the load with you. Thanks for taking the first half of this. And just by way of introduction, since I'm the least related to the food and agriculture sector, my name is Lauren Oates. I work on policy with the Nature Conservancy. So to Abby's point earlier about the environmentalists and the farmers all getting in a room together, it has been a real joy to get to know many people, fellow panelists, and a couple of people in this room as well. So to get back to it, this is largely about supporting farmers and those in the agricultural community following natural disasters and events, and creating really financial resilience and capacity to make sure that you all are supported and doing the things that you do to supply food and nurturing Vermonters and those in the greater New England area. So things that we discussed as a group and have elevated up for consideration by the Climate Council include building resilience funds following natural hazard implications, which Alyssa just spoke to. Farmers already are starting to experience significant impacts, not only from seasonal shifts and weather patterns, but also significant changes in the amount of rain and the persistence or prevalence of drought as well. And Abby can speak to just how much rain she's experienced this year down in southern Vermont, while people in the Northeast Kingdom were experiencing pretty significant drought at the same time. Another thing is the opportunity to update crop insurance. So thinking of new lending mechanisms for agricultural programs, just making sure that we're being really innovative with our funding and financing programs within the state and beyond to support farmers and those in the food industry. Another thing we've talked about pretty at length is making sure that state and federal-based programs have an opportunity to really identify and uplift climate practices, whether they're climate mitigation or climate adaptation practices, and to make sure that we're appropriately compensating or funding, incentivizing, what have you, those practices that can be done on the farm, since there's so much adaptive and mitigative capacity within our agricultural sector. And then finally, to make sure that the access to that financial assistance, technical assistance, and research is available equitably to all farmers and land workers across the state. Shifting gears to another key theme was obviously the support for local food systems, rural economies, and farmer livelihoods, and making sure that we're empowering those different networks to coordinate, communicate, to expand and grow. A couple of things here. You'll see at the very bottom, fully fund Vermont's Farm to Plate plan. And actually, Jake, for the record, didn't put that in there. I think a couple of us decided to actually poach quite a few strategies from the Farm to Plate plan and just adopt them right into this plan. So there you'll see actually a lot of consistency across the plan, since so much good work was already done through that process, which had a lot more time and didn't have to take place over Zoom, over 163 apparently public meetings, Ryan. Some other recommendations that we made were to develop and expand and sustain local markets specifically for food, ag, and forest products, making sure that we're investing in the infrastructure, distribution, and market development. We have a lot of conversations about the ability to make sure that we're creating sustainable workforce development and supporting members that are already within that workforce. Food insecurity came up quite a bit, obviously. We're on the tail end, not really the tail end maybe anymore of the pandemic, but seeing a pretty significant shift in food insecurity in the state over the course of COVID, as well as the early 2020 implications on CSAs, CSFs, et cetera, to make sure that we're supporting local systems, that we're creating space for food security, while also uplifting those local systems to help be that network for us. We talked a lot about ensuring and increasing equitable access for people who are historically underserved and disadvantaged. We tried our best, as Abby said, to make sure that we created a diverse subcommittee framework and try to outreach in a couple of different efforts to members of communities who typically aren't involved, but there's still so much that needs to be done there, and we'll talk a bit about that afterwards. We talked about expanding locally grown, carbon-friendly, and equitable access to food supply, food chains, and sources. And again, we decided to throw in fully funding Vermont's Farm to Plate plan, since there's so much good in there. And I think this might be the last of what's in the plan slide, so I'll try to round this out here. Create and support accessible research, partnerships, and education to shape land use for a sustainable and equitable future. Alyssa mentioned earlier a couple of key themes were to make sure that our land use policies are supporting our farms and forest land to stay farms and forests. And so a lot of our recommendations you'll see kind of relate to that. So a few specific actions we pulled out here include expanding funding and incentives to protect farmland from development. We know that there's significant transfer upcoming, both from generational land transfer, being the second oldest state in the country, and knowing that a lot of that land is in current ag production, but might be taken out if we're not making sure that we're creating guardrails and supporting that transition and keeping it in production. We talked a lot, especially with Judy Dow, who was an Abenaki elder, who provided a lot of really, really good perspective. The opportunity to elevate traditional ecological knowledge. So much of the work that they do and traditional ecological knowledge and share really supports climate adaptation and resilience. And so we wanted to uplift so much of that knowledge and opportunity and make sure that we're finding opportunities to incorporate it into state-led efforts like the Climate Council planning process and other climate assessments and frameworks. We talked quite a bit about expanding education, outreach, and technical assistance to make sure that we're supporting farmer-to-farmer learning and adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices. We talked about leveraging, again, some funding sources to make sure that we're elevating climate mitigation practices, like with NRCS. And I think we finally agreed on language, but I might be wrong, around the opportunity to create an Interagency Office of Climate Change, which essentially is an acknowledgement that a lot of state agencies work in deep, deep silos from one another and create significant burdens for land managers and stewards of land to actually navigate the different regulatory, permitting, all of the different programs within the state, and making sure that we're creating a space for all types of climate related or climate adjacent programs to connect, build off of one another, support each other, reduce redundancy, create some efficiencies, all of those jargony terms. And before we go to breakout groups and before I hand it back to fellow subcommittee member and our host, Jake, I do just want to acknowledge that what we just presented to you as far as what's actually in the plan only represents a really small fraction of the larger climate action plan that Ryan discussed previously. And these recommendations currently are only recommendations. The Climate Council, through the next 2 publicly warned meetings, will be voting or at least directly adopting all of the actions from the 3 subcommittees who have created them, which means the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and all of the recommendations that we've made will be up for discussion and a vote on Tuesday. So if you're so inclined, we can drop in the chat a link to joining that meeting because it is public, and you can see the discourse around it. I think generally speaking, we're anticipating broad support for food-related actions and maybe some greater discourse and dialogue around agricultural mitigation. But I think we're prepared to have that conversation and debate if it turns into it. And I did just want to also say that the plan itself is due December 1st to the legislature. It's going to be quite literally an 11th hour push, I think, to make that happen. But there's going to be significant opportunity between December and March, at least as we understand it, for public engagement and involvement and to adapt recommendations in the plan based on that feedback, which is why this is actually, even though it feels like really late in the game to be engaging the network, actually a really great time because we can bring feedback and understand how you as a network can help us implement that plan and adapt it over the course of the next few months. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and give it over to Jake.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Alyssa, Ryan, Abby. Covered quite a bit. And so before we do go to breakout groups, which there's the 3 questions that we're going to be focused on, is what needs to be added to the content, as Lauren was just alluding to a little bit, what role can farm to plate, the strategic plan and the network play in intersecting with the climate action plan now and also into the future. And also along with that too is just other organizations. How do we ensure that other food and ag stakeholders plug into this? And then as a part of that, the 3rd question or the 3rd point is looking for ideas for engagement and process. But before we do that, just knowing that we did cover a lot of ground, I'm just wondering, are there clarifying questions just kind of initial impressions or things that folks want to get out into the larger room before we then go into the breakouts. So I'm going to open it up. Yeah, so I already see Molly Anderson, you've got your hand raised. So Molly, go ahead.
Thanks, Jake. And thanks to all of the presenters, really interesting. And I so much appreciate the work that you've been doing. The thing that's a little surprising to me is that the possibility of reducing the herd of cattle in Vermont doesn't seem to be coming up in the Agriculture and Ecosystem Services Subcommittee. And doing that in such a way that it doesn't cause tremendous hardship for dairy farmers, for ones who want to do some kind of transition, having some support for that, moving into supply management or a state buyout of portions of the cattle herd. What we hear over and over again is that moving to a plant-based diet is one of the most significant ways that people can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm curious why that didn't enter at all. Is it just, is it a third rail in Vermont that we're just not going to touch that whole issue?
Anyone want to? Yeah, so Abby,
I
take.
can try to tackle that a little bit. I think one of the things that, well, for one thing, this was very high level. The point that we're at right now is very high level. And we did not go into overly granular level detail exploring the specifics of different components of the agricultural industry and what will be required specifically of each sector within the agricultural sector, right? In other words, what will be required specifically of dairy, livestock, vegetable, etc. I think the way that I try to sometimes frame dairy, at least in the conversation around in Vermont, is within the context of the soil base that we're working with here and the topography that we have. And so when you look globally at places where dairy is more predominant, it tends to be in temperate places like New England and the Northeast, where you can grow grass really well. You know, cows they're grazing animals, they're ruminants. And so I think there's a very complicated macroeconomic component to shifting the dairy industry that, you know, we could do an entire session on what that would mean and how we would approach that. That was not what this subcommittee was tasked to do. And so we really didn't. I think that also there is some really interesting research coming out of particularly the UK around, again, you know, grass-based livestock as a component of a sustainable and local food system. And again, I'll go back to the soil base that we have. I farm at 2,000 feet. I can't grow anything here but grass and cows, basically. And I can sustain and create climate resilience and natural functional working ecosystems by managing the animals and the land in reciprocity and relationship. And so I think it really is one of those things where it really depends on where you are, and that regional food system thinking is really important for when we start to think about what different regions need to be doing within their food systems. We have a lot of water here, for example. We received 22 inches of water just in the month of July alone, I think it was, down here in southern Vermont. And so a lot of the time, part of the reason for the rationale behind reducing cattle is the water that they take or the type of management they require. Both of those things can be mitigated for in Vermont. And I think it's our intention to try to learn more about how we can support the transition to those types of systems, and just be thinking about their system approach in a more climate adaptive way.
And thank you, Abby. And I think Ryan and then Alyssa might be able to build off of that as well. So go ahead, Ryan.
Alyssa, you had your hand up first. Do you want to
Oh,
Thanks,
sorry.
Ryan.
tackle first?
Sorry.
No,
Reverse
it's
the
okay.
order. Reverse the order.
I don't feel particular. Thanks, Ryan, though. I will just, I'll try to be short. I guess there were two things. The first is I heard Molly suggest buying out portions of the herd, and I actually don't know if any farmers have like requested that. And the second is I was reminded of an early conversation that we had in our subcommittee about kind of reducing the number of cows and how that potentially doesn't, if we eliminated cows in Vermont, it may not change the global balance of greenhouse gases. It just pushes the emissions to Wisconsin or California, where they're going to take up those contracts that get eliminated in Vermont. And so, I mean, I think that's a big issue with other things in this state, where if we reduce certain things that we're counting within our boundaries, we're just pushing those things to other states where they're allowed. And so I think personally, I felt like we should try to take responsibility for doing the best job we can here in our state, and knowing that agriculture is already contracting on its own. So that's all I'll say. But I did remember we talked about it a little bit in that context of, pushing cows out of Vermont is not going to change the amount of methane that's going into the atmosphere.
And then Ryan, we got Erica and Ollie, and then at that point, we'll make a transition to smaller breakout. Okay, go ahead, Ryan.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jake. Few just quick points I want to bring up about this question, and one can look to how we quantify emissions from agriculture. And that 16% to 15.8% looks at the non-CO2 emissions and fertilizer usage in Vermont. And it doesn't include looking at farms as how farms are managed, and it doesn't include soils, soils that have emissions and also sequester. And there was work undertaken in the carbon budget to look at the important role the soil can play in mitigating emissions from cows. And in Vermont, when we think about land managed by farms, farms actually manage more woodland than they do pasture, and manage more woodland than they do total harvested cropland. Put those two, pasture and harvested cropland, together, it's about the same as the forest you manage. And so when we think about farms in Vermont, when we think about cows that are grazing, you can look at the energy usage, tons of CO2 basis per, protein, it's very efficient use of way to produce, protein. But, farms are more than just the cows that are on them. And farmers manage many different land uses in the agricultural and natural working land space. And considerations of that aren't included in just the raw, 15.8% emission. It doesn't tell the whole picture or story. The displacement of emissions is a good question. And then also the suitability of soils and what happens if these are no longer farms. There's no protections against development by and large. And, that would be, some prime ag soils are really great places to, build the next subdivision. And so those are some of the considerations that went into recommending the current dominant production system we have in Vermont. Over 70% of the open land is still stewarded by dairy farms, and there are opportunities for them to mitigate emissions on a whole farm basis, looking at not just the cow manure management, but also how the crops that are grown to sustain those cows are managed and the role that the soil plays in sequestering carbon. And it can be a net negative, excluding even forest. If you bring the forest in or the unmanaged areas on farms, it can potentially be easier to get to that net consideration for a farm. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So Erica and then Ollie.
I just have a quick question about the research that you used. Actually, I wanted to say a quote too regarding the last conversation. I don't know where I heard it, but it was, "It's not the cow, it's the how." I don't know who to attribute that to, but anyway. But to Molly's point, plant-rich diets have been, have been shown to, reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So, I think the research is really important to look at. And I know some of the research is contradictory. So I think that is a challenge, but I am just curious for the council, like what research you did use, and, thinking about like the project drawdown research that, talked about food waste, for example, is one of the highest possibilities to reduce greenhouse gases, and other things, agroforestry. And I saw a bunch of things in there, but I don't know if I saw food waste, but I'm just curious, like how much research you used and what you used.
So there's a lot there. If we're talking specifically about emission reduction, quantification, tracking, that is informed by EPA's state inventory tool, IPCC research and guidance, and the Climate Council through the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee retained a technical contractor to develop a carbon inventory or carbon budget for Vermont to look at, for the first time, the question of comprehensive stocks and fluxes from different land uses that are quantified in the emissions inventory. That carbon budget will be going up, the report section of it will be going up for the first time, for the review of the report before the Climate Council next Tuesday. But what was provided in that report, I encourage folks to look at, because as we think about the sectors, the fossil fuel-based sectors, which have very discrete method for quantifying, both CO2 emissions that come out the tailpipe, it's much more challenging to look at the natural world and, measure emissions from a cow, measure emissions from the soil, and track that accurately. Where the Climate Council and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has made recommendations is for further research to better understand what is happening locally in Vermont, so we can inform and choose the best strategies to meet those emission reductions targets. And that requires specific local research, process-based models, which aren't just workbooks using generic national or international factors, which undergirds a lot of the emissions quantifications for a number of different tools that are out there. And so trying to calibrate that with local research is also an important step. And that is a major recommendation found in the mitigation section, as well as the sequestration section, is the need for further research and further local research to best understand what's happening, because this is definitely an area that needs additional study. But directionality, we know there's a lot of steps that farms can take to increase rates of sequestration in their soils and to directionally support those practices that we know have a benefit within a year, right? Cover cropping, reduced tillage, increasing managed grazing, cap and flare. Like, there's a lot of strategies that we can do, and we can quantify the benefits and better prioritize strategies as research avails itself as to the specifics of a reduction efficiency or other cost-effectiveness outputs that may come through the research that's recommended by the subcommittee. Thanks.
And before I go to Ollie, Lauren, I think you want to add something to that too.
Yeah, we kind of started to talk about when we were building out our presentation, acknowledging some of the shortcomings and frustrations with the process. And we didn't really get to that. I mean, you heard some of it from us, but one thing that I would have said is that because we were all in these separate Zoom rooms, the timing and the opportunity to collaborate with the other subcommittees was really, really limited. And to the question about emissions reductions and what science we were using, we actually had to work pretty hard as a subcommittee to kind of claw back the emissions reductions from agriculture. It's technically fell under the purview of a different subcommittee who was only focused on emissions reductions, but didn't have anybody from the farming or agricultural sector there. So we worked really hard to get that to fall back into our subcommittee. So that subcommittee had a lot of support through contractors to help model out their mitigation scenarios when we had some support through the carbon budget, but that was focused mostly on sequestration and storage. So a pitfall of the process that I just put a plug in here is that we didn't get the same support that a different subcommittee got to kind of really look in at those. And we had to do significant work just to be able to fight for discussing and coming up with the agriculture mechanisms, action strategies around emissions reductions. So definitely something I hope they change in the future.
Okay, and yeah, thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Ryan. And there's probably a lot more to that answer as well that we that we haven't gotten to. So Ollie, sorry for delaying going to you, but go ahead.
No problem. I think hopefully this is a quick question, and I think it's mostly for at least Ryan's part of the introduction. I think you said that ANR is going to be tasked with the rulemaking for implementing whatever the legislature adopts. Is that the case, or will the Agency of Agriculture have any purview over agricultural, rulemaking?
The way the Global Warming Solutions Act is drafted is it designates the Secretary of Natural Resources as being responsible for adopting rules to implement the Climate Action Plan. That's what it says. That will be the next part of the process of the Climate Council, and I think the evolution of this work, there's a next step to it, and I can't provide more commentary than that. That's what's written in the law.
So maybe a follow-up if there's time, Jake. Is there concern about agricultural rulemaking coming from the Agency of Natural Resources as opposed to the Agency of Agriculture?
Well, I think what we see in the Climate Action Plan is, for mitigation, there exists, right, the co-benefits that come from the water quality work the state is doing, right, huge adoption of practices on the part of farmers. Many of those have a co-benefit for climate and an emission reduction coefficient that can be assigned to those practices that are tracked on an acre by acre basis. And so working to quantify what the current results of state programs are for delivering agricultural mitigation is one of the first recommendations, and to understand where we stand on the first 2025 targets as an example. So that's definitely one of the next parts of the process in my view.
Okay, I think we cut into our breakout time, but I think this was important to have some of these questions with the full group. And so what I'm going to propose is that we'll go into the breakouts. We'll come back. We were planning to come back at 3:15. I think we'll come back at 3:20 and just have 10 minutes of wrap together. And one clarifying question that I wanted to confirm with my fellow subcommittee members is, and this goes into the conversations around engagement and process, is that the Climate Action Plan is required to be updated every 3 years. Is that correct? 4. Okay. Right. So just keep that in mind, that that this is the first, and that in another 4 years it will be required to be updated. And so I also call that out because there are recommendations that have been developed that might not make it into this first iteration of the plan, but will be identified as items for potential kind of further work and vetting. And so just know that there's what makes it into this first iteration may not be the only things that have been discussed and recommended to the full council for approval. So just wanted to kind of get that out there as well. Okay, so I think we are ready. This is just going to be a random assignment. There's going to be 3 rooms. 2 of the committee members will be in each room. And so let's initiate the teleportation to the breakout rooms. All right, so we've traversed the space-time continuum once again. We're back together as a full group. So I will just say I felt like our group was scratching the surface on the first question, which was amazing, and it leads me to believe that there's there's more opportunity to facilitate this conversation discussion moving forward. So I want to put that out there. I'm seeing some people maybe not nodding their heads, and I would love to have a further conversation about how Farm to Plate and the new network can facilitate that. But I want to make sure also that we just, for the time that we have, there were some conversations that got cut short in our group that we felt like would actually be good to bring up and answer in the full group. So I want to start there. So Natasha had asked a question about where does organic waste management, organics management fit into the climate action plan, and that's also an issue that spans the regulatory reach of both ANR and the Agency of Agriculture. So how is that being treated? And Abby was offering a response. So Abby, go ahead, maybe continue where you left off, and then we can also keep sharing some of our conversations from other groups.
I can try. I guess what I wanted to say to Natasha was, I think that honestly, the food waste issue, it came up earlier in the chat as well, right? It is an enormous component of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think Alyssa asked where it is in the inventory, and I have been, maybe Ryan knows the answer to this, but is it in?
No, it's not an emission.
Yeah, okay. So here's what I guess I want to say is I think education also came up in our group, right? And how the climate action plan or the subcommittee was approaching education. And I explained that that's become we're calling a cross-cutting pathway. And so the education content that came from our subcommittee is in a separate component of the climate action plan. And I guess this is as perfect an example as any to illustrate the immense importance and opportunity that we have. You know, people are so sick of hearing me say this statistic, but the average person is 3 to 4 generations removed from the farm, right? We consider food to be ubiquitous. That's a point of privilege, but in these spaces, that tends to be the case. I think it could also be said that that's potentially the case for folks who came up with the law. And so I think that there's a lot of nuance missing in terms of the complexities of the food system and its necessity, its opportunity, and then its issues that need to be mitigated for, and how to balance those factors. And I see food waste as a component of that. It hasn't, again, I'm trying to be judicious. It has been difficult to talk in as much breadth as this content really needs. And there is a lack of understanding, I feel, as to how deeply important the work that all of you are engaged in doing is, and how critical it is for our literal survival here, of which food waste, right, organic waste streams, our composting, all of those different things are so critical. And I don't know that we have achieved the level of education yet that is necessary for everybody to be bought in around that. And I think that that is one of the major opportunities and initial first steps that's going to come from, and maybe this network is a really good place to start with that, is to dive it. You know, we've got to help our people understand the importance of a local, resilient, adaptive food system. How are we going to feed and nourish our people in ways that ensure healthy soils, clean waters, access to culturally relevant foods, et cetera? And it's gonna be a bit of a fight. We're gonna need you guys. I'm just gonna put it out there. We're going to need support in that regard. There is a long road ahead in terms of bolstering and capacitating the efforts from this community in terms of taking us forward.
And just really quickly to add on to that point, the many great points that Abby is making, and this is something that actually Lauren has been pretty strong voice on, is that we, and this has actually happened with other climate legislation in other states, is that policymakers get so focused on gross emissions reduction at the cost of actually building out long-term resilience and adaptiveness that we'll need in this age of climate change as well. And so there's a lot, and the difficulty with that is that there's a lot of money that's potentially going into mitigation, and sure, that's great, but also that those resources should be finding a way to other aspects that that Abby is talking about that are absolutely essential in kind of transforming our society, transforming our food system. This is sort of this is the sort of once in a lifetime sort of societal change that the fight is on, I guess, to make sure that we don't limit where those resources are going and get ourselves stuck in a pathway that then ultimately is actually less resilient, less adaptive, and less sustainable over time. So that's my own. I'll step off the soapbox. That's about as soapboxy as I will get. Okay, so yeah, Jill. Yeah, Jill.
I'm hearing a lot of passion here. Pretty awesome. One thing that our group discussed was the importance of not looking at farms through one lens, right? Not looking at farms through the lens of climate mitigation or water quality or only this or only that. And Ryan brought up the population pressures on our land are going to be pretty great because of climate change and the importance of recognizing that issue. And I think the sustainable farm to plate can really help with this, because you do take a holistic look at agriculture. I live in a world that does sort of segregate. I'm hoping ecosystem services are going to get us out of that a little bit, and help us realize how the health of the land and the health of the farm and the health of the farmer serves the health of all of us. And I guess I want to reiterate that point, and I do think it's something Farm to Plate can help us reinforce.
Great. Other conversations that folks were having at their breakouts that you want to bring to the full group? Yeah, go ahead, Alyssa.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to echo. I don't think anyone from our group has mentioned things that we talked about. I think echo what we've heard here in terms of making sure that considerations around food storage and food waste get included into the plan, which we're just really grateful that this group, because I think it's kind of missed already. Another thing we talked about was how we did when we got the 3-minute warning, we went to, okay, what's the role of farm to plate? Well, let's get to the other question, right? But it did feel like we just scratched the surface, and we talked about the new structure of farm to plate and how really just elevating that the priority strategy team structure could be a great way to continue to make recommendations and build strategy to continue to feed into the climate action plan.
Awesome. Yeah, I was actually going to throw out there that so one of our topic exchanges is climate, soils, and environment, and we could certainly have a kickoff meeting that brings folks from this session and others who've been involved in the climate action plan process together to get a little deeper into all these questions. It seems like there's not a lack of content to get through, and also just to inform each other about what's happening in the climate action plan process, how to influence that, and also how to plan ahead and just advance these really important strategies and recommendations. So we've got, technically we have to be back to the full room in 4 minutes. So any other reflections or thoughts or things that folks want to share with the full group?
I just, as the moderator, I know that normally Jake would be saying this, but I'm supposed to help us end on time, and then Jake needs to be in the other room to welcome everyone back. So I want to make sure everyone has the link to go to the end of the day wrap up. And just thank everyone for coming to this session and really lending your brains to this important topic. So thank you. And if anyone hasn't gone into the forums yet, that's something new we're trying this year that can also be experienced. We'll see how that goes. Following up with chatting in those forums. I haven't had time to go in. Maybe it's exciting.
And I want to thank the Ag and Ecosystem Services folks on the Climate Council for working so hard. I know you've been killing yourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody taking time today to engage in this, and really hope that you'll continue to as we move along. Obviously, we're at the beginning here, right? And this is going to be a collective and community effort. And I'm really heartened and excited about the potential of this network and other just networks of really thoughtful, engaged individuals who are ready to dig in and make sure that we can feed our people and have clean water and healthy soils. And just thank you so much for all your efforts and good work.
I wanted to echo the thanks for everybody who's on that subcommittee. And I know that this is just a little part of what you're doing. You're also out there running your farms. And I know John Roberts is also participating in the Climate Economy Action Center for Addison County. So he's kind of a liaison between Addison County and what's happening at the state level. And I don't know how you guys do it all.
We sleep very little.
Abby does it. Abby does it from her tractor. That's
only occasionally. No, I have a really amazing apprentice, and I would not be able to do this without him, and a very healthy 67-year-old father. So and mother. So yeah, that's how. Support, community, resilience, right?
Yeah.
And Molly, I no longer milk cows, so I've got all the time in the world.
Oh, John.
Well, I'm very appreciative.
The modest,
and also
the
appreciative to
also
Farm to Plate.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like we could continue this into the night. And if we were in person at this point in time, we'd probably be migrating to grab a drink together and commiserate a little more, but also I think inspire each other and then come up with some great ideas. So really appreciative of everyone's time and just focus. It's been a long day, but some really deep conversations that are happening here. So thank you. All right, yeah. So with that, let's jump sort of to the final close for the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.